Let me just start by thanking our cooperation partner, Dekkiche Austria, and also by the other cooperation partners of today's event, weltumspannend, arbeiten, Jugend, Eine, Welt, and Fairtrade Austria, which have kindly co-organized today's event together with ÖFSE. ÖFSE has been actually doing some work during the last couple of years on the cocoa value chain, which you can find on our website. And I'd like, in that context, particularly thank my colleagues Hannes Grohs and Jan Grumiller for the high quality research work they've done, and also for organizing today's conference. With that, I'm looking forward to a very interesting discussion, to a hopefully lively debate. And I wish you all a very successful event. And I hand over to our co-organizer, Ute Meyerhofer from Dekkiche Austria for her words of welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. I also want to thank all of you, especially ÖFSE. I'm really looking forward to the discussion and the debate. I also thank everybody who is listening, because I think it's a very urgent issue we want to look at. I just read, I think 2 days ago, the last report of Caritas Ghana, one of our partners, who is addressing child labor in cocoa areas. And they are telling that according to research, the proportion of children from agricultural households in cocoa growing areas that are engaged in child labor in the cocoa sector across Ghana has increased from 31% in 2009 to 45% in 2020. So although there are quite a number of private sector, private public and public initiatives implemented for more than 20 years already, and a lot of research and exchange is taking place and going on, still we have to talk about issues like child labor or other human rights and environmental issues in that sector. And that's why I think that cocoa is quite a good example that voluntary commitment by companies is not sufficient. That's why I'm happy that we are here now, and I'm happy to welcome you in the name of Dekkiche Austria to this webinar and to further discuss chances, but also possible challenges of an effective EU due diligence legislation. Thank you. I'm glad to listen to everyone.
Thank you, Ute. And hello to everybody also from my side. I have the honor to facilitate this discussion. My name is Karin Kübelberg, and I'm also from the Austrian Foundation for Development Research. Ute already said it is a very timely moment to discuss due diligence and child labor. It is also a very timely moment to discuss cocoa and chocolate issues, because Easter is rapidly approaching. And Easter is actually the time of the year in many European countries when the most chocolate is consumed. And Austria, where our organization is based, is the second country in the world in terms of per capita consumption of chocolate. Austrians consume on average 8 kilos of chocolate per year. And only the Swiss, and Sarah can maybe tell more about this, consume more than Austria with about 9 kilos. The global average on chocolate consumption is less than 1 kilo per year. And in many countries, chocolate is hardly consumed at all, for instance, in China. When we talk about cocoa and chocolate, actually concentration is the word that comes to my mind. And in preparing this conference, I found that 60 seems to be a number to remember, because more than 60% of cocoa comes from only 2 countries, namely Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. 60% of cocoa processing is done by only 3 multinational companies, Barry Callebaut, Cargill, and Olam. And 60% of cocoa beans are imported to Europe. So we see that in many different aspects, the cocoa sector is very concentrated. And one more important number I want to share before we go into more detail is less than 10% of the profits are generated in cocoa producing countries. So this low income of cocoa producers has severe consequences in terms of poverty, in terms of child labor, and in terms of environmental impacts. And in the past years, these issues have become a major issue of concern to both producers and consumers. And we will see in this conference that in the past years have seen a wide range of efforts in the cocoa sector, from governments, from corporations, from civil society, from farmers' organizations. But however, much more needs to be done, and we are going to discuss about what has to be done to improve the situation and to tackle the huge scale of this problem. So today in this conference, we're going to look first at the current situation and at existing initiatives and their impact. And then in the second round, we will discuss how new policy proposals, such as the EU corporate due diligence legislations, and also debate about living income differential, how they have the potential to improve the sustainability in the cocoa value chain. I am very happy that we have very distinguished experts at our conference, and also I would like to welcome the audience. We've also very distinguished experts in our audience, and I hope that you will participate actively in the discussion that we're going to have after the presentation. So how are we going to proceed? First, my colleagues Jan Grumiller and Hannes Grohs will present the findings of their study on the cocoa value chain that they have conducted together. And then we will discuss this in more detail with Friedel Hütz-Adams from Südwind Institute in Germany, with Michael Odijie from University College in London, and Sarah Dekkiche from the International Cocoa Initiative. And I will present our colleagues to you after the presentation of Hannes and Jan. So after their comments, we will open the floor for your questions and for your comments. So Hannes Grohs is a researcher at the Austrian Foundation for Development Research, and his research focuses on the global value chain analysis, industrial policies, and development economics and policy. And Jan Grumiller is also a researcher at ÖFSE and focuses on global value chain analysis of different sectors, industrial policies. And they both are co-authors of the study, Sustainability in the Global and Austrian Cocoa and Chocolate Value Chain. And also they conducted several other projects on economic, social, and ecological sustainability in value chains with a focus on cocoa. And I copied the links to the publications and to the study in the chat, and I will do this maybe afterwards again if because some people maybe hadn't joined when I had posted the links. Okay, so we are very much looking forward to your presentation, Jan and Hannes, and I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you, Karin, Werner, and Ute. So now we, Hannes Grohs and I, will start the presentation on sustainability issues in the cocoa value chain, from voluntary initiatives to binding rules. And as already mentioned, this presentation is based on a study we published a year ago, a policy note that we published this week, and the working paper we published in 2019. Yeah, and the links you have in the chat, and they're also on the ÖFSE website, of course. And now Hannes will give you an overview of the structure of the presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jan, and also a warm welcome from my side. So the structure of our today's presentation is as follows. We will first give you an overview of the cocoa global value chain, or GVC in short, briefly discussing the structure and governance system of the chain, but also the key sustainability issues. Then we will present a brief assessment of what has been done so far, in particular with regard to industry initiatives and certification schemes, before turning to key recent developments, the living income differential on the one hand and EU due diligence legislations on the other hand. In the end, we will discuss our conclusions and policy recommendations to stimulate the panel discussion, which we are very much looking forward to. And with that, I give back to you, Jan.
Yeah, thank you. So let's start with giving you a brief overview of the cocoa global value chain, or GVC. Linking to what Karin already said, here we look at the global map of cocoa, and what we see is that cocoa production, or the production of cocoa beans, is located primarily in the global south, and in particular in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. And both of these countries actually produce roughly 60% of global cocoa bean output each year. On the other hand, as we already heard, consumption primarily takes place in the global north, with Europe and the US being by far the largest consumers. Now let's briefly take a look on the chain and production steps from cocoa bean producers to consumers. And as Karen already said, it's important to note that the cocoa GVC consists of two key processing steps that follow cocoa bean production: processing, or grinding, where the intermediate cocoa products such as cocoa liquor, butter, powder are produced and then sold to chocolate manufacturers who sell their products mostly to retailers. Now, to better understand the cocoa GVC, I think it is, next slide please, also important to look in more detail where these production steps happen and who is involved. Because cocoa bean production in the global south involves approximately 5 million smallholders and contributes to the livelihood of up to 50 million people, even though there are different studies out there with a little bit different numbers. And grinding, on the other hand, is located in the global north and global south, but is highly concentrated, as we have heard, with 3 companies controlling roughly 60% of global capacity. And chocolate manufacturing is also almost exclusively done in the global north, and also relatively concentrated with the largest 6 companies roughly controlling 40% of the global market share. And this structure is important in order to understand the power structure in the cocoa GVC, which has been described as having a bipolar or tripolar governance structure. So bi or tripolar means that there are 2 or 3 key groups of firms that have the power to significantly influence the structure of the chain, of the cocoa chain. So most authors have characterized the cocoa GVC as bipolar, to highlight that the key power in the GVC lies with grinders and chocolate manufacturers, even though there is an argument to be made that chocolate manufacturers actually have more power in the chain because they have the control of the brands and a higher share in value added, and because integrating into grinding is relatively easy. But some authors have also argued that the governance structure is tripolar because retailers also increasingly have their own brands, and because they select the products in the shelves and they set the final price. Okay, since we now briefly looked at the basic structure of the cocoa GVC, we want to give you also a brief overview of the key economic, social, and environmental sustainability issues. And the key economic sustainability issue is low and unstable income of farmers. And this needs to be understood in the asymmetric power relations in the cocoa GVC that we just discussed. Because when we look at the value share in chocolate products received by farmers, we find that it is low and has declined in the last decades. Gilbert, for example, estimates that the share of cocoa farmers in a chocolate milk bar declined from 27% in the 1970s to 80s to 9% in the 2000s. And other studies suggest that the value share of farmers is currently roughly between 7 and 11%. In addition, the recent decades have been characterized by low prices, and this is also extremely important. And this is what we see in this graph. So real cocoa prices between the 1960s and today, and that's what we look at here. And we see that since the 1990s, real cocoa prices stayed below the $3,000 per ton mark. And this is what many commentators believe to be the level where cocoa farmers would have the possibility to have what could be called an acceptable livelihood. Okay, so that's not a number that's to be taken as a given, but as a rough estimate of what could be believed to be acceptable. So now over to you, Hannes.
Thank you, Jan. As Jan said, so the low income of farmers is one of the most pressing issues in the cocoa chocolate value chain. And the perspective we want to offer here is that other important challenges in the sector are intertwined with farmers' low income. So I will now briefly present numbers on child labor and deforestation as major social and environmental challenges in the chain. And both phenomena are complex and of course not reducible to low income of farmers. However, we argue that they need to be understood always in relation to it. So child labor. in Western media, child labor on Western African farms, so we are basically talking about Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, received broad public attention for the first time in the early 2000s. And as a reaction, the global cocoa industry and governments agreed on the so-called Harking-Engel Protocol, in which they declared the intention to end the worst forms of child labor and forced labor. And the International Cocoa Initiative, ICI, was established to actively support this intention. And since 2010, progress and the elimination of child labor is monitored scientifically. And the latest report stems from the National Opinion Research Center, NORC, at the University of Chicago, and it reports on the cocoa season 2018-19. And the numbers show that child labor is still widespread in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. So according to NORC, 1.5 million children were working on cocoa farms in the respective cocoa season. 95% of these children were exposed to so-called worst forms of child labor, like working with sharp tools, working long hours, night work, or carrying heavy loads. 94% were working for the parents or close relatives. And now to have it in context, so there were two other studies by Tulane University 5 years and 10 years before, and the NORC report now says that due to methodological problems, it's not really easy to compare these reports in absolute terms. However, what seems to be quite clear is that the number of children working in the cocoa sector increased over the last years rather than decreased. So this again must also be seen in the context of the increase and intensification of cocoa production in those two countries. And what is very important further is to make meaningful statements about child labor in the cocoa sector and to understand its prevalence. Indicators such as type and hours of work and the school attendance of children should be considered, but I think we will deepen this in the discussion later on. So as a last key sustainability issue in the cocoa and chocolate GVC, we want to speak briefly about deforestation. And while economic and social challenges in eager low income and child labor, as already mentioned, were for a long time the focal points of sustainability concerns, deforestation has been acknowledged as a third major challenge more recently. And also here, the historic and recent numbers are a reason for concern. Just to give you an idea, so Global Forest Watch estimates that the humid primary forest cover decreased by 26% in Côte d'Ivoire and by 9.3% in Ghana within 20 years, so between 2002 and 2020. And according to the Cocoa Barometer 2020, natural forest cover in both countries together has declined by more than 70% in the past 3 decades. So even though cocoa is not the only reason for deforestation in both countries, it is a key driver. So why that? Of course, the expansion of cocoa cultivation competes with forest cover, especially if cocoa hybrids are used, which provide higher yields in the short term, but also require more sunlight. And for a long time, the expansion of cocoa cultivation was promoted and incentivized without any consideration of deforestation. And the absence of clear land and tree tenure further contributed to a widely uncontrolled dispersion of cocoa farms, also in formerly protected areas in those countries. So in a third step, in the next step, we want to take a look at what has been done to address the sustainability issues. And we won't go into much detail here, but we would like to give you an idea of the institutional setup in which initiatives have developed so far. This setup can be described as a public-private hybrid dominated by industrial self-regulation. That means that state regulations, in particular in producing countries, haven't been completely absent, and there are also partnerships between private and public actors, but not at least in the context of the governance and power structures of the GVC, which Jan presented. Private actors in eager large multinational companies are decisive to the design of sustainability initiatives, their implementation, and also their effects. So speaking about industry self-regulation, we can differentiate 3 types or tools. In-house sustainability initiatives, third-party certification schemes, and sector-wide initiatives and associations. In-house sustainability initiatives use different sustainability criteria that aim at different scales to support farmers, cooperatives, and their community. Achievements of such initiatives usually are reported in annual business reports, often along with figures on the amount of processed cocoa that can be traced back to its origin. Example would be the Cocoa Life program of Mondelez or the Nestle Cocoa Plan. Third-party certification schemes, such as Fairtrade, for example, have been considered as the central tool to reach sustainability in the cocoa and chocolate GVC since the late 2000s. As most of you know, certified cocoa ensures that farmers fulfill certain economic, social, and ecological standards, and farmers may benefit from certification through higher prices and also other non-monetary support. However, it must be also critically noted that the adaptation costs and investment risks, even though farmers are supported, largely lie on farmers. In addition to in-house initiatives and certification schemes, there is a number of sector-wide initiatives and associations which aim for sustainability in the cocoa sector. Here, the World Cocoa Foundation needs to be mentioned, an umbrella organization of cocoa and chocolate manufacturers representing more than 80% of the global cocoa market. And members of the already mentioned ICI include cocoa and chocolate companies, civil society, and international organizations, as well as farmer organizations. And eventually, the Cocoa and Forest Initiative was established in 2017 and includes leading cocoa chocolate companies and the governments of Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. And to somehow conclude here, all of these types of self-regulations and initiatives might be important tools in improving sustainability in the cocoa sector, and successes are also to be shown. However, there are also major shortcomings, and just to give you an idea, the range, for example, with regard to certification schemes from certified cocoa produced in formally protected areas to the fact that not all cocoa produced under certification can be sold as such. And where individual programs have proven successful, such as child labor monitoring systems, it must be noted that they until now remain limited in light of the scale of challenges the cocoa sector faces. So what we have not seen in the last decades is a structural change within the cocoa and chocolate GVC, especially when it comes to the income of farmers. Even with certifications, no prices are currently being paid that could be considered a living income. And with this, back to you, Jan.
Yeah, so now we want to give you a brief insight into the recent policy developments and discussions. The living income differential in the key producing countries, Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, and due diligence legislation in consumer countries. And both are to some extent a move away from private voluntary initiatives that dominated the sector in the last decades, like Hannes just discussed, towards binding rules. So first, let's discuss the living income differential. It is based on the bilateral cooperation agreement between Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, which is sometimes called the Abidjan Declaration, that aims to increase and stabilize cocoa prices and farmer income. And in order to understand the living income differential, you have to, it is crucial to understand that both countries have strong cocoa regulation in place and set producer prices. So the price that farmers receive, right? So, yeah. the problem is, or what you could call a problem, what we want to point out here and underline is that the producer price that the cocoa regulation body sets, CCC and COCOBOD, they are called, these cocoa institutions that set the producer price. And this producer price is based on the future market, right? So the world market price. So even though they set the producer price and stabilize the price within a specific season, the level of the price is actually determined by the future markets. So that means by the world market price. And the living income differential was initially an idea to de-link the producer price from future markets. But this was rejected by multinational firms because it opposes their pricing strategies, and most importantly, probably because it's likely to imply even higher prices. And instead, multinational firms agreed to pay $400 per ton on top of the cocoa future price. And Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana agreed to pay a minimum cocoa price of $2,600 per ton. So of this, 70% would be received by farmers. So this would be quite below the $3,000 mark that is often cited as being necessary for what could be called an acceptable livelihood. So let's briefly look at what this means in a little bit simplified way. It means that in the first scenario with the future price, so a world market price of $2,000, the living income differential would amount to a price of $2,400 because it's $400 on top of the future price. And the minimum price set by Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana would be $2,600. And the difference would have to be paid by these countries or by COCOBOD and CCC to the farmers and other actors in the chains. On the other hand, if the future market price is higher, then CCC and COCOBOD do not have to pay the difference, or actually can pay higher prices to farmers and receive higher prices and income. So overall, the main problems of the living income differential are that it continues to be linked, or that's what we argue, it continues to be linked to future prices, and that the minimum price is difficult to maintain in times of low global market prices, since it requires a stabilization fund. Because the difference between the world price and minimum price needs to be paid by Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. And another issue is, of course, that the living income differential only covers Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. And this is, if you are interested in this more detail, we can discuss this later on, but it's also in the Tröster et al. Paper from 2019, where we discussed this in more detail, which is on the website. Yeah, so now back to you, Hannes.
Thank you, Jan. So while these debates about the lid are important in producer countries, so are the discussions about mandatory due diligence laws in consumer countries. In particular, we speak here about the EU. And currently, 2 national due diligence laws are already in place, namely in France since 2017 and in Germany since last year. And interestingly, both also call for the need for an EU-wide regulation. And the implementation of an EU-wide regulation is not unlikely, actually. And in November 2021, the European Commission published its proposal, on the one hand, on a regulation on deforestation-free products. And only 1 month ago, it published its long-awaited proposal on a directive on comprehensive corporate sustainability due diligence. And actually, the cocoa industry was faster than the European Commission. And already in December 2019, the so-called Cocoa Coalition published a joint position paper calling for an EU due diligence legislation, which could create a level playing field, requiring all firms to invest in the context of what the Cocoa Coalition calls a necessary transformation of the sector to sustainability. And just to let you know, the Cocoa Coalition includes the main multinational companies such as Mars, Ferrero, Mondelez, Nestlé, as well as the major certification organizations and some NGOs like the Voice Network and ICI. So what can be potential impacts of such due diligence laws? And based on initial insights from French and German law and the current EC proposal, some first assessment can be made about its effects on the cocoa sector. So what seems quite clear, we would argue, is that mandatory due diligence increases transparency, as companies must establish risk management systems related to human rights and environmental violations. And so we would argue that the EU legislation, as already the French and German law did, and other specific laws in some countries, will further increase transparency in the cocoa sector. And the first signs of this were already visible actually with regard to the deforestation directive, which is not even in place. And so, however, the impact of this legislation and thus in total and thus also on transparency depends on the scope of the respective laws. That means at what size companies are included in the law and for which segments of the value chain are they held responsible. So another aspect crucial to the effectiveness of the law is the issue of liability. Changes are more likely to occur on the ground, so in the cocoa producing countries, if companies can be held liable for abuses rather than limit their obligations just to risk assessment and monitoring. So the German and French laws are largely limited to risk management, but the current EC proposal provides for increased liability, and here we will see how discussions will evolve. The actual design is still very controversial. And so most importantly, what must be said, also with a view to the cocoa sector, that due diligence laws do not have a direct impact on farmer prices and therefore have limited ability to address one of the biggest, as we argue, challenges in the cocoa sector. And as a last point, interestingly, the Cocoa Coalition has a clear stance on these potential limitations of such a law just mentioned, and it is in favor of a rigid and comprehensive law that includes all companies, no matter of size, and provides for dissuasive penalties and access to remedies. And in addition, the coalition calls for bilateral cocoa partnership agreements between the EU and cocoa producing countries. And such agreements should promote an enabling environment for sustainable cocoa production on the ground and thereby increase the effectiveness of a potential EU due diligence law. And now Jan will tell you our policy conclusions.
Yeah, thank you. So what are our key messages? So our key argument is that the cocoa GVC continues to be characterized by severe sustainability issues, and that many of the social and environmental challenges, such as child labor and deforestation, are related to the low income of farmers. Even though, of course, these issues are complex and the income of farmers is not the only factor that needs to be considered. And what is clear that the voluntary private sector initiatives in the last decades were important, but the impact did not ignite structural change. So this is the reason why we need more binding rules, or we argue we need more binding rules. And this is also shown by the fact that parts of the private sector call for more regulation and the level playing field. For this reason, we also argue that the recent initiatives, such as the living income differential and due diligence legislation, are important, but their effects remain to be seen, right? And potentially, they do not go far enough because of the structural weaknesses of the living income differential and because due diligence laws are likely not affecting the income of farmers in a meaningful way. This is the reason why we suggest a delinking of producer and export prices from future prices, because this would enable producer countries to set prices independently from the future market. And this would allow for the setting of global minimum prices. This is, of course, not an easy task because it would require the support of large multinational firms, but would also require the cooperation of key producer countries and likely global supply management. but overall such an endeavor is desirable and would be possible with the support of multinational firms. And we argue that the current developments on due diligence legislation, the living income differential, and the willingness of many large firms to promote change, this has opened a window of opportunity for changing regulations on price setting that could have a more profound impact on cocoa farmer income. Because without increasing the income of farmers, we will not be able to enhance the sustainability in the cocoa sector in a meaningful way. This, of course, does not mean that many of the fruitful initiatives and private sector programs that have been implemented in the last years should be abandoned. But yeah, I think that's clear anyway. Okay, so this was it from our side. Thank you for listening. Now back to you, Colin.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jan and Hannes, for this very interesting presentation, and thank you also for sticking to your time without me saying anything about it. So we are going to deepen the discussion now with our three experts that we have invited, and I'll present them briefly to you, and then I'll start to ask questions on those issues. So Friedel Hütz-Adams is a researcher at Südwind Institute in Bonn, and he has published many research papers on different value chains on various products, and cocoa is one of his main foci. He is co-author of the Cocoa Barometer, which is a very important study that gives an overview of the cocoa sector and the problems in the sector. And he's also engaged in a network of non-governmental organizations called and unions called Voice, working on cocoa, and has been a member of Rewe Group Sustainability Advisory Board since 2013. And since you're in the spotlight right now already, I think we'll start with you, and then I'll present the other panelists afterwards. So Friedel, we have heard that there's a lot of initiatives in the cocoa sector, and as you also write in the Cocoa Barometer, many initiatives, but very little progress in terms of child labor, in terms of income of farmers, in terms of environmental destruction. What is your take on this, and why is this still the case? Why is there so little progress, and what would be the issues you would like to focus on and deepen more on the presentation?
Well, there is a number of reasons, and I will start with one thing which was already mentioned, and that's the price question. I know that companies usually they don't like to talk about prices, but at the same time we have a fierce competition in the chocolate sector about every cent in the cost structure of a bar of chocolate. And so even companies who say on the one hand, we want to be more sustainable, they will often buy the cheapest cocoa which is on the market, despite knowing that this causes problems along the value chain for farmers, but also concerning deforestation. This is also true with living income differential. It was mentioned already, but one point was missing. On the world market, you have a certain price level from the stock exchange, and then you have often a quality differential. So cocoa from Ghana can be 200 or 300 euros above the price at the stock exchange. And what the government's planned was to add the $400 as living income differential and increase the price for farmers by $400. But despite the fact that all major companies agreed on praising the living income differential, in the end, they combined their power, and the governments, the Cocoa Board in Ghana and the Cocoa Agency, the CCC in Cote d'Ivoire, they had huge difficulties last year and this year again to sell their cocoa on the forward market to stabilize prices there long before the season started. So rumors say that some companies put so much pressure on the two agencies that they bought cocoa without quality differential, or even with a negative quality differential. So the same companies who say we need more money in the value chain took it away because they said, well, competitors are doing the same. And this is one of the striking facts in the sector, that everybody knows that you need to inject more money in the sector to improve things, but put the pressure on everybody who is down in the value chain. The same is true with certification and standard bodies. If you would ask in a closed room the people from Rainforest Alliance or Fairtrade, they would say, of course, we need a higher minimum price for Fairtrade, or we need higher premiums, which are both paying. But the moment they increase minimum prices and premiums, it might happen that companies are not buying the certified cocoa anymore, but go into the cheaper non-certified or the company-owned certification systems. So prices all along the value chain are a huge problem, and this is why so many companies are in favor of a legislation. They know that we will not solve the problem on their own. And one more point to give you some of the dimensions in the sector. In 2016, in September, when the projections for the next starting harvest were that there would be a bumper harvest, the cocoa price within a few weeks went down $1,000 per ton, from 3,000 to below 2,000. A few months afterwards, I was in Côte d'Ivoire on a conference, and there was a woman which said that she's so fed up with the discussions about children's rights and child labor, because her option is either to send her children to school and not having them to help her harvest, meaning less cocoa, meaning less money, meaning no food on the table, or to send the children to work. At the same conference, many people in the industry praised themselves for all the projects they were doing, 50 million here, 20 million there. And I raised the question, well, you are offering 200 or 300 million all in all, but due to the price decrease from one season to the other, $1,000 per ton, 4.5 million tons, you save $4.5 billion in your purchasing department. So these are the dimensions we are talking about. What we should also mention, but it's not the main subject here today, is that, that we should have this in mind, that also the governments in the main producing countries, they have to become more active, meaning supply management, support farmers to diversify, setting up a pension fund for old farmers so that these can retire and young farmers take over. We need, Ghana has it, at least a little bit of it, but in Côte d'Ivoire we don't have it. We need health insurance for farmers. We need better infrastructure. The moment governments would protect their natural reserves and farmers cannot go into protected areas anymore, we would have less cocoa on the market. If you kick out the farmers who are now on protected areas in Côte d'Ivoire, there would be a few 100,000, so that's not possible to kick all these farmers out of protected areas, but at least to stop this process and to reduce the amount of cocoa coming onto the market. That would also something very important. All in all, we need indeed a discussion about de-commodization of cocoa. We need to link this to human rights, but this is something for the second round of our discussion. And yeah, we need openness for companies to pay more, simply as that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks a lot, Friedel, for also illustrating the dimension of these price differences and what it could mean for income of companies, and what it means, like what is also the relation between the money paid for programs, but the sum saved for if the price is going down. So before we are certainly going to discuss what can be done with the price stabilization in the second round. But let me first introduce Michael Odijie to you. He's a research fellow at the University College London, and he works on child labor issues, on slavery issues, yeah, and was also a fellow. He was also a fellow on the Center of African Studies, and he focuses especially also on the links between child labor and political economy and historical relations. So what you've heard that Michael despite all these initiatives of reducing child labor and all those programs that have been introduced, we have heard also by Ute in the beginning and also by Hannes that child labor has gone up in the past year. So what is your take on the child labor and human rights issues in the cocoa sector, and what would be the remedies to solve this problem?
Okay, thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation. I also want to say I enjoyed very much reading the summary of the paper that was published on, I think, on Monday. So on the question of child labor, there's a difference between the way we view child labor from outside looking in and the way child labor is sort of viewed in both Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. So especially in Côte d'Ivoire, there's a difference between child work, child labor, worst form of child labor, child trafficking, child slavery. There's all of this is going on in cocoa production in Côte d'Ivoire more than in Ghana. So with this term child labor just covers so much. I think it would have been better to maybe focus on, say, child trafficking. I think it was last week there was a case of 11 children being trafficked, I think from Burkina Faso into Côte d'Ivoire, and they were caught by the police. So this is actually going on in Côte d'Ivoire. That's child trafficking, child slavery, as opposed to just child labor. There's child labor, but there's also child trafficking and child slavery. In Côte d'Ivoire more than in Ghana. So my research is much more on, say, child trafficking and child slavery. But just to go back to the presentation, because I really enjoyed it, this focus on price, like if you increase the price, then everything gets better, is interesting. But I think one thing that is missing in the literature, in the paper, is costs. That's cost of producing cocoa. Not just the cost, but the conditions of producing cocoa. I mean, there's this. I understand that the research is mainly on the value chain, but if you think of the cost of producing cocoa now and say 20 or 30 years back, there's a wide difference. There's even a difference in the cost of producing cocoa in Côte d'Ivoire, in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Cameroon. And I think just as you use the difference in price to explain deforestation and child labor in your work, you can equally use the difference in costs, the cost of producing cocoa, difference in labor. In Côte d'Ivoire now, farmers need sometimes 3 times or even 4 times more labor than they needed in the 70s and in the 60s and in the 50s. We can go about the reason, we can go about why this is the case, but there's a difference in costs. So even if you increase the price, and if the costs keep going up and up, you just have to keep on increasing the price. So I think the question of cost, maybe you just have to look into this question of cost, because one of the reasons why farmers are moving into protected areas in Côte d'Ivoire, it's so they can have access to virgin forests. The reason is because there's a difference. If you're farming cocoa in virgin forest, the cost of production is very low. So if you are replanting, you have to employ more labor. You have to invest more in terms of cost of production. So you can just, the way you've used price to explain the difference, you can equally use costs. And in my view, I think cost explains some of these problems, especially deforestation, more than price. Because the reason why farmers are moving from one forest to another, so if you study the cultivation pattern in Côte d'Ivoire, it follows deforestation. Farmers tend to farm in one region, then move to another region, then move to another region, move to another region. The reason for this is because they want cheaper cost of production. Replanting means they have to invest more. So I think that's really important. That's something we really have to look at. So there's this issue of price and power difference, but the conditions of producing cocoa at the local level, it's something that we have to understand. Then, but there's obviously some good news. In the paper, you made reference to the increase in processing in Côte d'Ivoire and I think in Ghana. This is actually creating a local chocolate industry. In Nigeria, Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, there's now chocolate producers, which is something we had very little of in the past. So in my own thinking, obviously, I think there are so many problems with the living income differential, which you didn't touch on. Obviously, last year, both Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana had record harvests, if I understand correctly, because there's a link between the perception of increase in price and increase in output, which further reduces price. So when you have more harvest, then the world market price goes down. So there's a link between the LID, the living income differential, and a reduction in world market price. So there are so many problems with the LID. It may not be obvious now, but I think in 4 or 5 years' time, it will be obvious. So the idea of delinking producer price from global price. I mean, I don't know if this is possible. I would like to ask, is there any apart from cocoa, is there any other case? Can you give just one example where producer prices in a given product is completely delinked from world market price? It seemed far-fetched. The solution might be for Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire to bring in Nigeria, Cameroon, and some of the other countries, and then do what OPEC does, which is use supply to influence price, as opposed to just delinking the price. I don't think that's even possible because multinationals which simply move to, which is what they are doing currently with the LID, simply move their business elsewhere or just move things around. How to do that would be very difficult. In 1987, I think Côte d'Ivoire tried to do this. They stopped selling, I think, for about 2 years, maybe close to 2 years, in an attempt to influence world market prices, but they didn't succeed. They came back in 1989 and just continue the way it used to be. In my view, I think maybe it would be better for them to come together, restrict supply, use that to increase price, and then that will be better in terms of the price angle. But the completely delinking price from producer price, it's a little far-fetched. Yeah, I'm not sure if there's any other thing I want to talk about. But the EU, the due diligence, I don't know if I should just talk about it now or
no, in the next round.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael, and thanks for also sharing your skepticism about the proposal that Jan and Hannes have made about delinking the price. I think we should certainly discuss about if this is possible, and also for bringing up again this idea of a producer association, because this is also what I am always thinking. The production is so concentrated in so few countries. Why don't they get together and influence the price level more? So maybe also Sarah can also tell us a little bit about the discussions on this, but mainly I would like to present our third discussant to you. Sarah Dekkiche is Director of Policy and Partnerships at the International Cocoa Initiative since last year, and she has worked for more than 10 years for organizations as CSR Europe or Amphore 2050, and has a lot of expertise in business and human rights issues and also human rights due diligence. So maybe some words also about ICI. It was founded in 2002, is a Swiss-based non-profit foundation with a mission to advance the elimination of child labor. And you have members in, like the stakeholders include the chocolate and cocoa industry, civil society organizations, certification bodies. So you have a broad range of stakeholders and are very much involved in the discussions that are going on at the industry level and regulation level. So Sarah, what is your take on the discussion on child labor and advancing human rights and sustainability issues in the cocoa value chain? And maybe you want to also comment on some issues that have already been raised in the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, a lot has been said. So indeed, maybe I'm happy to come back to certain points. I'm not an economist and I will not be able to enter in a full debate about the price, but that would be an element. But maybe I think in the introduction, a first point was made about the increase in the number of child labor, and indeed that's a sort of a starting point, and also why we are here. And it is true that there is, and studies show, an increase in the proportion of children in cocoa related child labor, but this increase, I think, should also be seen in a context of an increasing number and proportion of households growing cocoa, and an increase in cocoa production overall. So I think the numbers have always to be seen in a context and in absolute terms. Over the past decade, it is true that cocoa production in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana has increased by 62%, in fact, and the proportion of agricultural households cultivating cocoa has increased from 55% in 2009 to 86% in 2018-2019. But among agricultural households growing cocoa, the prevalence of cocoa-related child labor has increased from 31% in 2008-2009 to 45% in 2018-2019. So you see that the proportion of children in cocoa-related child labor has increased at a slower rate than the proportion of households cultivating cocoa and the volume of cocoa produced. That was mainly, maybe just to also put that in context. About sustainability issues and the price for living income, as it was mentioned, indeed, the low income or the income issue is both a root cause, but also a consequence of child labor. And it is absolutely clear that farmers should be making a decent living, and farmer income is an essential piece in the puzzle when it comes to tackling child labor. That is absolutely no debate. And the price paid for cocoa is, I think, one aspect of the whole equation that contributes to farmer income. So maybe just briefly on that, I think that so to tackle this challenge or within this puzzle, I think what shouldn't forget that also a certain ecosystem needs to be in place. It has also been a bit mentioned before, and infrastructure needs to be in place. At ICI, a study we have done some time ago shows that an increase in income does not automatically lead to a reduction in child labor. It does when certain things are met. And it depends on certain factors, among others, whether it's a short-term injection and to what extent the also revenue is distributed evenly throughout the years, among other factors. So I think we should just also keep in mind that taken in isolation, it is not as such a whole solution. And generally, it is also likely that without access to basic needs, such as education, without also certain infrastructure being in place, without other sustainability things being tackled, and also without market improvements in cocoa household income, that can also be derived from other communities, by the way, progress in reducing child labor might be slow, and any price increase needs also to be accompanied by supply management measures. And voilà, so that was on that. Generally, earlier also a number of things were measured, whether measures and efforts taken by companies, voluntary initiatives and regulation. And I think all these aspects taken in isolation are not enough, but what is needed is a little bit of everything. And I think that is key, and that is very important. In terms of measures and what has been done, and maybe also what initiatives have done or what companies have done, one can see the glass half full or half empty. Indeed, over over 10 years, maybe not enough has been done, but I would argue that already certain things have been done. And usually I try to prevent to fall into this dichotomy from nothing to everything. And we will go into the debate about regulation, and indeed the shift from mainly voluntary initiatives to more mandatory and initiatives and regulations is a driver for responsible business conduct and things that go with it. But also that, of course, taken in isolation will not be enough. So maybe just about initiatives and examples of what has been done so far. Over the past years, studies that are derived from the NORC study and also studies we have done, actually they are quite similar in some of the conclusions they reach, show that industry-led interventions over a 3 years period have led to a 1/3 reduction in the prevalence of hazardous child labor in communities in which these interventions were led, and we have also reached to up to 50% reduction in child labor prevalence among children identified in hazardous child labor through systems that allow to identify, prevent, and address child labor. And at ICI, we have started to implement this kind of human rights due diligence systems before they were called human rights due diligence. So we have started to implement child labor monitoring and remediation systems back in 2012. First with Nestlé, and now it's an approach that is spread across the sector. And from this several years of experience, these are the kind of results we have reached. And it also allows us to learn from what works well and what works not well. And I think today, indeed, we know that they can reach when designed in a certain way. And there are also certain benchmarks that we have done with other organizations in the sector that define the minimum criteria and indicators that this kind of systems should meet in order to be effective and impactful. So we are able to measure that, and we are extending that in to the sector, but it also allows us to learn from what needs to be done to scaling up. And maybe just to explain you what we call a child labor monitoring and remediation system in a couple of words. So in short, the CLMRS. So it's a system basically that is aligned with the approach of ongoing human rights due diligence, as international frameworks have asked it now some years. 10 years ago, we celebrated last year the 10th anniversary of the UNGPs, but also as more and more regulations, legislations require it. And we know that there is an EU directive now on the table. And I think over the years also we shifted from an approach that is mainly punitive to an approach that is more risk-based and based on the principle of ongoing improvement. And this is also what the CLMRS is all about. So it's articulated around 4 principles, and an effective CLMRS should incorporate these 4 principles, with the first one being awareness raising and monitoring. So it's about explaining to children, to families, to farmers, and any other stakeholder involved in it, basically the difference between child work and child labor, or hazardous child labor, or forced labor, etc. What kind of work is okay and what kind of work is not okay, is dangerous for the child and therefore should not be done. And voila. And the second principle is about case identification. So finding those children that are at risk of child labor or effectively in child labor, recording that information and making sure that these children get the right support, and partnering with the right organizations, including governments, including civil society organizations in the communities in a certain geography, to provide the right support, which is also a way that leads to the third element, which is remediation. So that is actually the remediation support, which also allows then to be linked to prevention. So the more we know where to remediate, the more we can prevent it upfront, and of course do a follow-up. So on an ongoing basis, regularly see what happens, whether the situation has improved, and what we can do maybe more. So and these kind of systems, I think, have now started to show their effectiveness, and we start to know when are they effective and where not. And now indeed the whole challenge is about scaling them up throughout the sector. And for that, I think legislations are also a driver, but I don't want to be too long. We can come back to that later, I guess. Okay. Otherwise, I will talk for the remaining 45 minutes.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Also, thank you for illustrating that when there are initiatives by industry on certain cases, then the child labor cases are going down. The question would be a little bit, how can this be scaled up to the whole sector?
That's basically the whole issue, indeed. Indeed.
So we have already some questions in the chat, but I would first ask one last short question to you, Jan, because also Michael has said that there is a more processing of cocoa now going on in, for instance, Nigeria and in other countries. You have worked a lot on the question of value chains, linkages, value addition in countries. Do you see a chance? I mean, we have now talked a lot about the price, and I think we should also talk more about the price setting, but the other side would be higher value addition in countries. What kind of chance do you see that there is higher value addition from the cocoa industry in West Africa, for instance?
Yeah, should I maybe briefly also address the question that Michael raised on the delinking of future prices, or should I only talk? Yeah, yes, okay. So, so Michael said, and I mean, I agree that it will be very difficult to delink future prices, so the export price and the farm gate price from future prices. So we are not arguing that it's going to be easy. And you reference this to the 1980s, where Côte d'Ivoire also engaged in supply management and tried to raise prices through that. And we have seen that this is extremely difficult in the case of cocoa compared to, for example, the case of oil, for a variety of reasons. So I will not discuss this in the detail, but I think there are two main differences that we're facing today compared to the 1980s. And the first difference is that in the 1980s, or the late 1980s, I think it was in 1987, Côte d'Ivoire was alone. So it was not supported by Ghana. And today, there is a close cooperation between Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, and they together have 60%. And I mean that you said, you know, yeah, minimum prices, or you said that they should engage in supply management, and we completely agree that, you know, supply chain management is the way to go, and even minimum prices should be, you know, accompanied with supply management, right? With supply management. But in the best case scenario, we would argue, you know, that we have currently this whole debate and companies on board that say, okay, we actually need change. We have seen, you know, private initiatives are not enough. We need more binding rules. And this also relates to what Friedel said, that, you know, there is, if there is no level playing field, then there will always be the companies that try to pay the lowest price. So I think in the best case scenario, supply management would be accompanied with a minimum price. And in the best case scenario, this would be delinked from the future price. And there is currently maybe this window of opportunity where firms, because there is this whole debate where firms are on board, the cocoa initiatives and so on, and argue that we need change. So maybe today is actually today, or that the time period where companies may agree, okay, you know what, we need more change. And I mean, I agree that, you know, it is far-fetched in the sense that, you know, the political relations currently do not really point to that. You know, the firms, of course, do not want to pay higher prices. That's why we have the whole issue still going on 20 years after, the whole civil society pressure increased. But I think it is nonetheless important to talk about it, because Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, and that's the main point, they also wanted to do this when they implemented the living income differential, and the firm said no. So I think we should still, talk about this. Why are you saying no? And we see there are so many problems attached to the living income differential. So we should not stop the debate on the whole issue, even though I completely agree, it is difficult. And with regard to the other question on chocolate, so in development economics and in the GVC literature, this is a key question, because from a developmental perspective, one key way to improve a country's or firm's position in the value chain is functional upgrading. And in the case of Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, this would mean, of course, moving from cocoa bean production to grinding and chocolate manufacturing. And in the last 3 or 2 decades, both countries were actually quite successful in promoting local grinding because of industrial policies like tax reductions, low cocoa bean prices, and so on. But the problem is that the local industry is also dominated by large multinationals. And that limits production linkages, and production linkages are the key benefits related to functional upgrading, because it means that the initial investment creates more investment and more economic activities, and this is rather limited in the case of grinding. And this is not to say that there are no local firms. There are also some local firms, but the majority of the capacity lies with multinational firms, also in what is called origin grinding, so grinding in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. And also, what is another issue is that the profitability of cocoa grinding in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana without incentives is rather limited. In particular in Ghana, because of higher electricity prices, which is why, higher electricity prices, but also the stability of the electricity, they have to invest in generators and so on and so on. But this makes it difficult for these countries to reduce the incentives and really start profiting a little bit more from building these industries. And the other issue is chocolate manufacturing, like Michael mentioned, which is a really profitable business, of course. And here the main point is that chocolate manufacturing is generally done in consumer countries. So there's currently, what I would argue, a rather limited business case, except for niche markets, for producing chocolate in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana in order to export to Europe or to US. So the question is, who do you sell local manufactured chocolate? Because chocolate consumption in Africa is at the moment relatively low, even though it is rising, as Michael mentioned, it's actually rising relatively fast. But this means that the local and regional West African market alone is likely not large enough, and also for to build a large-scale chocolate manufacturing industry, because currently there are a few firms, but they already produce much more could produce much more that they could sell. And also, I don't think it is really a great idea to promote chocolate consumption in West Africa, because chocolate in the end is a luxury product. So yeah, so I'm not sure if that is a viable strategy.
Okay, thank you, Jan, for your comments on this upgrading and processing issue. We have already some questions in the chat. I have seen your hand, Sarah, that you want to comment on something. So we have actually in the discussion on prices, on the question of how of child labor and how to prevent child labor. We had also the discussion about what Friedel actually raised about the competition between companies and competition on prices. So I think this will be maybe also Friedel can say a little bit more on prices and competitions, and what I was also thinking on this question of profit margins in the cocoa sector. Is there really such a harsh competition that companies couldn't afford, for instance, to pay higher prices? And maybe the issue of diversification also we haven't raised. But let me first take some questions from the audience, and please also feel free to ask more questions in the chat, or also maybe to come in and raise your hand. There is one question to you, Michael, a very concrete question. Why is it cheaper to produce in virgin forests than in other places? Because you said it's cheaper to kind of move from one place to the other, and this contributes to deforestation. This is one very concrete question. Then there was some questions, and there was also discussion already going on in the chat on child labor. Would it be possible that higher prices trigger more child labor? Or another question is also, do we need a more differentiated notion of child labor or not? I think, Sarah, you have explained already a little bit about this. Yeah, maybe these two questions. Why is it cheaper to harvest in virgin forests? And yeah, what would happen to child labor if prices were higher or lower? Higher.
Okay. Let me just answer the question in terms of labor. So in virgin forests, cocoa farmers tend to have less weed, less diseases, which is where most of the labor, not harvesting labor, it's directed at. So in virgin forests, the amount of labor that an average cocoa farmer would require to farm, let's say a hectare or 2 hectares of cocoa, it's completely different from the amount of labor that the same cocoa farmer would require to replant. So there's actually some research on this done in Côte d'Ivoire and in Ghana as well, but mostly in Côte d'Ivoire, showing that the replanting phase, that if you are not planting in virgin forests, you tend to use between 2 and 4 times more labor. This is to say, if you employed 2 people planting in virgin forest, you now have to employ 6, 10, or 16 people, as the case may be. Now, because cocoa farmers don't have control over price, this extra labor, they have to pay for this extra labor. So in order to save costs, it is better for them to occupy one forest and then move to another forest, and then move to another forest, and then move to another forest. This is actually the link between cocoa farming and deforestation.
Oh, I see.
If you look at the map of cocoa farming in Côte d'Ivoire from early 1920s to 1970s, so you can see the map of deforestation. They're just moving from one forest to another, from one forest to another.
Which is a huge problem in terms of environmental impacts and also climate change.
Yes, obviously.
Yeah.
It's sort of boom and bust. There's actually a cocoa production model showing this. Cocoa farmers tend to move to a particular forest, plant, harvest, then after about 15 to 20 years, move to a different forest, plant, harvest, then move to a different forest. Now, because there's no more forest in Côte d'Ivoire, then they are now forced to replant. So the question is how to account for the extra labor. Do they now have to employ more people? Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Sarah, you had raised your hand. Did you want to comment on something that Jan said, or?
Well, it was linked to the price question, and maybe also to add that, and that can be a link to one of the questions that was asked. I think indeed it is the risk that a price increase, again, if not coupled with supply management measures, can indeed link or lead to more child labor. I think it's the NORC study that shows it as well, because it would lead to increased production, and the risk is that, again, if other things are not done in parallel, it can in fact lead to child labor. And I think it's also within this complexity that companies, or some companies, are now moving to cash transfer or more cash transfer programs. And actually recent research that we have conducted, IICI, and where we looked at the impact of regular cash transfers on 600 cocoa growing households in Ghana. So the study was in this first phase focus on Ghana, shows that indeed cash transfer can help reducing child labor, and therefore help families to cope during difficult times, because it is a way to support the farmers financially, independently of price issues that can and unintended consequences. And this for several reasons. First of all, because the payments come at regular intervals throughout the year, including during the non-cocoa season, so including during lean seasons, which is especially useful for families who might not grow anything else and who might therefore struggle outside of the harvest season. And cash transfer can also be independent of the amount of cocoa grown generally. So just to say that there are also alternative avenues that are explored to address the income challenge, which are not purely price related or market related.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Friedel, do you want to comment on the price issue and income issue and how to scale up different initiatives?
Yes, I must admit that I'm always a little bit surprised when companies worry what increases of prices can lead to more child labor, because the same companies often do not worry what a price decrease means. That's a very cynical debate. It is clear that a farmer who gets a much lower price, like it was in 2016-17, from one season to the next, of when price dropped in Côte d'Ivoire by 36% from within short term, that farmers often then cannot hire adult labor anymore, and then the cheapest solution is to take your own children. What was also striking in Côte d'Ivoire was usually you have a mechanism that if prices go down, farmers produce less. What happened in Côte d'Ivoire is they produced more, partly on new areas, but also when prices decrease, you try to harvest every single pot to increase your volume. Every single pot means more labor. So it is a complicated connection between labor and labor amount and child labor and price. Indeed, there are some studies specifically from India where they proved that increasing income could mean more child labor, but you have to look very carefully in it. If you have, for example, a society where they have a lot of cattle, sheep, and you have to look at them. Yeah? You have an income increase and you increase the amount of animals you have, and then you need more labor until you reach a point when you can hire adult labor. So it's often not possible to compare between different crops. Coming back to what does it mean to have a price increase, if you pay, Sarah, what you mentioned, if you pay extra social money into a family sector, it is some sort of premium for growing cocoa. You don't call it a price increase, but from a company perspective, cocoa gets more expensive. It also gets more expensive when they hire you to do your CMLRS. So companies, they are investing. Your question was, is the glass half full or is it half empty? My answer is it's not big enough. That's the first problem with it. You could scale up all these successful projects. Why do we not have child labor monitoring already on most of the farms? Only on a small, relatively small percentage after 10 years of successful pilots. Why do we have only pilots like Tony Chocoloni? Rewe has one together with Fairtrade and GIZ. Lidl is running one. You have a few company projects where they pay significantly higher premiums and test, can we reach a living income? Some of these were successful, but there's no sign that they are going to scale it up. They are testing these things, and this brings us back to the second round we are planning. From my impression is that they are testing these things for the moment the law comes. Huh? Mm-hmm. If there is a law, you want to have things in place that makes your chain transparent. This is why they are locating by GPS many million farms already. They located 1 million in West Africa, and they are polygoning it. They want to have more direct value chains. They want to have more control where the cocoa comes from. But then the risk is, if you know exactly where the cocoa comes from and you see that there are many children working, there's a direct connection between the farm and the shelf in Europe. So another step you need measures in place by premiums, by social welfare money, by higher prices, whatever, to reduce child labor, to reduce malnutrition. We only talk about child labor when we talk about human rights due diligence issues, but can you feed a family? That's also a human right. Can you send your children to school? Can you afford a doctor? These are all basic human rights, which if you see that even certified farmers in Côte d'Ivoire, it was a study last year, on average have half of the living income, half of it. You know, but there's a big gap. And so they are doing this pilot to be prepared if the political pressure increases. And then they have to scale up and make the glass, which they already have, much bigger.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Friedel, and thanks for making the bridge also to our second round, because you were saying there's a lot of pilot initiatives and a lot of trials, and the pilot initiatives show that they can be successful. And it's interesting to hear your assessment that they're testing for the mandatory legislation. So what do you all think about the discussions now about the corporate due diligence that is going on in Europe, which would mean that basically all big companies have to implement due diligence measures and to kind of have more transparent value chains and to see if there is if human rights are respected within their value chains. And the example is often taken of the conflicts minerals regulation that is now already in place, and this should be kind of a scaling up to all sectors and to all companies. Do you think, I mean, and what we also have to say, the discussion on corporate due diligence now in Europe is only starting, and there has been only the first draft being published by the European Commission. So this will be a very, very lengthy negotiation process, which will last for years, probably, or at least other experiences show this. So what would we expect from this legislation? Can it really help something? Is this first draft enough? Could this change something in the cocoa sector in terms of human rights, but also in terms of the other issues that we have discussed, especially income of farmers? That is a big problem. Yeah, who wants to step in to give their assessment about the mandatory human rights and due diligence legislation?
Well, let me just say, what struck me about the due diligence legislation is that companies are allowed to use third-party verification, which is really interesting, because it means that they can just offload their responsibility to a third party. I was trying to think how this would apply in cocoa farming, because it means they can just, you know, push compliance to supplier, ignoring how their own business model creates some of the human right abuses. Case of child labor, for example, or deforestation. So it seemed to me that this would create just a new auditing industry. So I'm just criticizing the third-party verification, just that part. I understand that the document published last month is just a draft. So, but there are so many problems with the draft. But the third-party verification, I think, is really shocking, because for example, Mars or Nestle, all they need to do is just require their supplier to do ABC. So you're just pushing the responsibility to somebody else. And the problem, I mean, the presentation today talked about how the percentage of a chocolate bar that goes to farmer has reduced over the years. So this new auditing industry means it's taking some part of the price of chocolate bar, which could mean that farmers would end up earning less, because this is a new, so in the production chain, this is just a new niche, the auditing niche. I mean, this is,
yeah. So your fear is actually that there are new actors in the value chain that will even get also a part of the income, and who are the ones who are going to lose out are the farmers, because auditing companies basically also want part of the income.
The third party, I think the term used was contractual cascading. The third party just simply means that you're creating a new niche in the production chain. These are the auditors, and there's no direct responsibility for chocolate manufacturers. So they can just require suppliers to do ABC. Then the suppliers would then have to employ auditors.
Yeah, maybe for the audience who is not so familiar actually with the due diligence legislation, the draft of the due diligence proposal is actually based on the 6 steps also defined by the OECD due diligence guidance, which would mean that companies have to introduce different steps in order to have a better overview of their value chain. So they have to integrate this into the company's policies. They have to identify risks in their value chain. They have to design strategies how to prevent or how to minimize risks in their value chain. In terms of, they have to establish a complaints procedure so that people who are affected by human rights violations can complain. And then they have to monitor their business, and they will have to report on this. So it will be putting more responsibility on companies to have a better overview of their whole value chain, so that they cannot say, okay, we don't know what is happening on the ground because it's not our responsibility. So it basically forces companies to have more responsibility of their entire value chain. And this has been a huge discussion that has been going on in the past years, that this is needed, given that global value chains are global and have to be, the responsibility also of companies has to be global.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, Sarah, what do you think about this proposal, and will it change something in the cocoa sector?
Okay, so maybe generally about indeed having a directive before looking at this one specifically. I think, well, as we said, indeed, it was something that was demanded for a long time, and it is quite clear indeed that legislation, if it is well designed, so then indeed the whole question is it well designed, but can drive change. And the fact that regulation also puts an obligation on company to operate with due care through doing ongoing human rights due diligence, I think is also a way to put it high on their own agenda. So in that sense, it's clearly, I think, a driver for responsible business conduct in general, to address human rights challenges overall, and of course also in the cocoa sector. And therefore, it's also a way to push companies to implement and integrate these systems that allow to constantly prevent and address child labor in our case. I think in that sense, the directive as it is remains quite general, which was to be expected. And of course, it will not take away the implementation challenges. So how concretely do you do it, whether you're a trader, a manufacturer, a processor or retailer, will still remain challenging, and voila. But this is why, and I think it's anyway already a next step announced by the European Commission, maybe sector-specific guidances, supporting materials will be needed. But we already see that it is driving corporate behavior. And maybe to come back to the point mentioned earlier, I don't know if these initiatives, including on cash transfer programs, are only a substitute for the moment, as before any legislation is taken. We see, at least for Nestlé, who has been announcing their cash transfer program, that they are doing it at scale. They are now rolling it out at scale, combined with CLMRS and combined with any other measures to really address it at the large scale. So driving sustainable supply chain at scale through this kind of effective systems is key. And we also see that cocoa producing countries, at least in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, are also getting ready themselves. They have also announced cocoa traceability systems and measures, in addition to other measures they had already in place, national action plans and others. And now I think the whole challenge will be about integrating the system. So it would be a pity if we end up with a multiplication or a proliferation of different measures of different systems. So now the whole challenge, and we are working on that with the other organizations in the sector, including with the governments of Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, is to move towards an integration of systems, so that also private systems and data can feed into national systems and data, who can themselves then inform also better policies, better measures, including social policies and programs, among others. So I think that is also quite important. And so it will drive transparency, it will drive traceability, but we have to make sure that this is all done in a coordinated manner. Also on traceability overall, also integrating the different sustainability issues. And then indeed the last point is, but it's also quite clear, I think we cannot put everything on the shoulder of a regulation. Like any legislation, you can achieve certain things, but not everything. And I think to be effective also, and to support and allow for responsible business practices being really effective, you also need the famous enabling environment. So it's also important to continue to support the right policies globally, such as such a directive, but also nationally. And that also requires provide technical support, financial support. And indeed, that's one of the points we have made in our paper that was mentioned in the introduction about partnership agreements. I think it will be very important that cocoa consuming countries and cocoa producing countries work hand in hand, and with all other stakeholders as well. So that's maybe on the notion or the principle or the idea of a directive overall. Now this specific proposal that is now on the table, I think indeed it incorporates many things already. Indeed, it is based on and acknowledges or recognizes existing international frameworks, such as the UN guiding principles, such as the OECD due diligence guidelines. So that's indeed a very, of course, an obvious basis, and it includes the principles of due diligence overall. Some of them might not be very clear, especially the notion of whether as a company you are directly causing, contributing, or linked to potential or actual human rights impact is not reflected in the directive, and that's a core element of the UNGPs. The fact that it is mainly targeted at larger companies and letting out smaller companies, at least in the direct scope, can also be a shortcoming. And also the notion of established business relationship is a bit of an unknown notion so far, which can also lead to the risk of cascading down the due diligence responsibility only through contracts, might also be dangerous or limiting. So indeed, there are some good things and it's a good basis. There are some missing elements, and it will now be indeed an interesting negotiation over the next month between the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council of the European Union, so European member states, and we'll see what comes out of that.
Thank you. Friedel, what is your take on this proposal, and will it change something in the cocoa sector? Maybe you can also address Michael's concern about the new auditing industry that could take part of the
yeah, I want to start with that. I share this concern because we already have a private auditing system which is not working. Here in Germany, the industry says 80% of the imported cocoa is sustainable. It's pure greenwashing, and they define sustainable as being certified. Fairtrade and Rainforest, which are the biggest certifiers beside the company projects, they stress that the cocoa is not certified because they say we have no influence on prices, we have no influence on income. Still, some umbrella organizations of the industry on their websites and some companies on their website keep on lying and say our cocoa is sustainable. So there is a danger that they make a tick box approach. They go, they look at the plantation, they see, oh, there's no child labor. Oh, the farmer is only earning half of a living income. So where are his children? Perhaps on the pineapple plantation next door, but they are not working in cocoa. So no child labor. This is a real risk, and there is a multi-billion industry which is earning a lot of money on this. The same is true for the company-owned systems, Cocoa Plant, Cocoa Life, name them all. It must not become a ticking box, but that's different to Michael. I see the legislation as a tool to overcome this. Because presently the companies can say something is sustainable, and if you go into the plantation and they find child labor, now they can say, well, but Fairtrade guaranteed there is no child labor, and they tick the box that there is no child labor. But everybody knows that the income of a certified farmer is so low that the risk of child labor is very high. So according to the German legislation, and this is similar in what the EU plans, companies still have to do a risk assessment on their own. According to the UN guiding principles, they are not allowed to rely on third party. And this is one important point. The second important point with the legislation is, and again, it has not to become a ticking box. Sarah, you mentioned what Nestle is doing, and I also think it's very interesting what they are doing there. But according to their own briefings, there is a gap between living income and present income of $2,500 US. And with their additional money, they're closing $500. What are they doing with the remaining 2,000? As long as competitors are not doing anything, they can't afford just simply to pay more. We have such a competitive market. I was once in a meeting here in Germany 10 years ago when a retailer, and at that time for a milk chocolate bar, the price entry in Germany was 35 cents. So the retailer wanted to go to certification, and then the producer said it's 1 cent more per bar. The guy from the sustainability department of the company said, there's the problem. The lady responsible for purchasing it said, are you crazy? That's our margin. And when I said, well, increase the price by 1 cent, and all looked at me as if I'm crazy, because they said, but our competitors are then cheaper than us. If you look into brand producers where the bar is sold at a much higher level, of course, if you look at present cocoa price, it's for a 100-gram bar milk chocolate, 30% cocoa content, it's roughly 8 cents per bar, the cocoa in it. And about 5 cents of this are reaching the farmer. If you sell it for €1, it would be no problem to double what the farmer gets. It's much more money for advertisements in this bar of chocolate when they spend on cocoa. But again, they are looking for a level playing field. Here in Germany, there is a magic line of 99 cents or special offers of 68 cents recently for Rittersport and Milka, I've seen, 69 cents. You know, and if you would tell Rittersport and Milka to spend 5 cents more per bar on cocoa, they would say, when we go bankrupt. But if they know that all competitors are also doing it, and when suddenly at the lowest price you get your special offers before Christmas and before Easter, it's not 69 cents, but 74, there is the problem. Everybody here in Germany can afford it. So this is why we need such a legislation, and this is why many of the chocolate and cocoa companies are in favor of the legislation, because if you say it straight, for a Snickers or a Mars or a Kinderschokolade, the price of cocoa, pure cocoa, is nothing compared to what they sell it for and what they spend on advertisements. And still every cent counts. Human rights due diligence is one thing, having the cheapest price is the more important thing presently, and the legislation can change this.
It's interesting actually that at the same time the market is so concentrated and margins, I mean, profit margins so low that they cannot afford, I mean, that they really would go bankrupt if chocolate would cost 2 cents more, or many people would. Is it really such a big issue, this competition issue?
Yes, because it's you have to divide the market. There are chocolate companies who have very high margins, and there are others who are barely surviving. And the same is true for traders. Many traders like ADM and Continaf, Amajaro, they all left the market in the last years because they were not making money. On the other hand, Barry Callebaut or Lind or Ferrero are highly profitable. Lind, they just recently published, I think they have a net profit margin of roughly 10%. But Ritter for many years barely survived because they were under much more price pressure than Lind with a more expensive chocolate. I suppose I don't have internal figures. So yes, it is a competitive market. Plus the companies they want to have high profits because they want that the shareholders get the money, or the families. We published that in the last Cocoa Barometer. There was an extra payment to the Ferrero family. If I remember it right, it was 600 million or something. It was extra, additional to the usual payments. If they would have halved it, they could have doubled the price for cocoa they pay. So price pressure can mean you survive. It can mean your shareholder or the family gets angry.
I see. Yeah, so there's a clear argument for a level playing field for the whole sector, basically. Jan, do you want to add on this? Will the due diligence legislation change anything in the?
Yeah, I think the most important aspects have already been mentioned. I am also, I agree with what Friedel said, that it is a step in the right direction, in particular with regard to, to creating what could be called probably a level playing field and incentivizing companies that currently do not do enough to ramp up their efforts. So yeah, I think most of the important aspects have already been mentioned, and I'm also a little bit more optimistic. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, in our presentation, I mean, our key critique is, of course, that the impact on prices is likely to be relatively low, and so that remains a big issue, of course.
Yeah, this would be the last chance also for the audience to either raise their hand or to ask a question in the chat, because I'm going to come to the concluding round. Okay, we have one question. Civil liability regime of the directive is requiring a failure to due diligence leading to adverse impact. It's requiring. You think that right holders will be bringing cases to European courts? Yeah, so how big is the chance that right holders, that this complaint mechanism is going to work, and that the European court, the cases will be brought to the European courts? Anybody wants to come in this question? Friedel, you unmuted yourself. And then Andreas is asking, why can't companies agree jointly on a higher price?
Well, if one point is functioning in Europe, and specifically in Germany, it's the anti-cartel legislation. Every meeting we have with companies in the German Initiative on Sustainable Cocoa, we get, there's a paragraph read that we don't talk about prices, margins, profits, and so on, because according to cartel laws, if three big companies would meet in a room and decide, well, we double the cocoa price, they would go to jail. It's allowed to have child labor in your value chain, or even slave labor in European legislation, but it's not allowed to have cartel agreements. So companies have to be very careful. The way you can go and step around is, and this is why we did this, I was part of some of the things, we calculated a living income for Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. And a single company, they can go now and say, well, our farmers are earning half of what we need. How much do I have to increase the price? What support does the farmer need? What support measures as a premium or as social welfare money or what else? This is allowed. Every single company can do this. And if they have to obey to a legislation, we will have to do it. But the moment they meet in a room, they run into a major problem. Civil liability, yes, of course. NGOs are waiting for this. They have to make value chains transparent. And if you know that there is persistent child labor, persistent malnutrition, persistent slave labor or something on a certain farm, and they are in the value chain of a certain company, of course, NGOs, lawyers will need this to sue companies.
Maybe on that, and I'm not a lawyer to judge indeed how effective it will work, but indeed an argument brought up, and that is probably a legitimate one, is that, or that can be heard, is that as it is presented so far, indeed the focus, well, is very much on the process of due diligence, of course. So some NGOs indeed ask or claim that the liability is more on the process and less so on the result or on the outcome, so on the actual harm. And I think that will probably be part of the debate moving forward, related to civil liability indeed. But for the moment, as it is designed, indeed any entity, I think, could say that a certain company has a due diligence process and system that is not thorough enough and therefore not designed to address human rights harm. And we will have to see how it works. But indeed, one of the criticism is that it would not sufficiently address the questions of harms and remedy.
Mm-hmm. We have one last question in the chat. Do you think it is more likely that the delinking of producer prices from future prices is established, or that we have an entire new economic system? So the question is actually how do you assess the probability that this could be done one day, to delink the producer prices from the prices on futures? Stock exchange, basically, in financial markets.
I think it's completely impossible. Yeah, so the way out would be to restrict supply, control supply, and then increase price. Mm-hmm. That's also a way of empowering Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, because whether you like it or not, there's one of the real problem here is power. So the power in the value chain, which Jan touched on in the presentation. So the power is basically concentrated in the sort of producer, the manufacturing part of it, while farmers are less empowered. But if Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and maybe one or two other countries can come together and then use restriction of supply to increase price, mm-hmm. Obviously they can, just the way OPEC did, they can I think they'll be able to maybe take some of the power from manufacturers. I think that's one way of, in my view, I think that's the only way actually, mm-hmm. of controlling the price. But I think it probably would be difficult because of what I think Friedel touched on, which is Cote d'Ivoire and the cocoa, Ghana's cocoa roughly have, I think, roughly a 5 or 10% premium, because mm-hmm. it's considered to be better than Cote d'Ivoire's. Mm-hmm. So there's really no sort of parity there. So how to bring everything together, and then I think it probably would be.
So this would be your key last message for us, Michael, that if you could decide, I mean, maybe this, I'm going to ask you this as a last question for the last 2-3 minutes that we have. If you could decide on one main measure to be implemented to improve the situation of cocoa farmers and the producing countries, what would you implement?
Yeah, I think, restriction of supply and then diversification. I think diversification mm-hmm. is even more important. So because of going back to the cost of producing cocoa, some farmers, it's really difficult to keep on producing cocoa because of the extra cost. Mm-hmm. So in the case of Cote d'Ivoire, for example, the poverty that we keep hearing about is not uniform. So some cocoa farmers are actually doing very well, whilst others are not doing well. So there are so many reasons why this is the case. So if I can do anything, to say some farmers have to stop producing cocoa and maybe produce something is diversification. Mm-hmm. In the case of Korea, and then Then the sort of COPEC, that is cocoa, CCC and Ghana Cocoa Board. If they can come together, it's easy to bring Nigeria and say Cameroon. I think if you bring Nigeria and Cameroon, it's over 60, it's close to 70% now. So they should be able to control the price by restricting supply and also promoting diversification.
Okay, so bringing countries together, forming a COPEC, and diversifying the economy so that less farmers are reliant or are dependent on producing cocoa beans. Yeah, Sarah, is there anything that you would like to give us, and what would you do if you could decide?
If there was maybe one effort, or at least indeed to come back to the scale up challenge, maybe one thing to mention to reach that, it's indeed to multiply efforts to extend the reach of these effective measures that allow to prevent, address child labor as aligned with the human rights due diligence requirements. We know that today up to 30% of households in cocoa growing communities in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana are covered by those. I think the challenge now is to scale them up in an integrated manner among themselves, but also with public systems.
Thank you. Friedel, what would you do?
I know that this is one of the buzzwords. It's holistic approach, and it covers what Michael mentions, it covers what Sarah mentioned, but it also covers we need to get much more access to the data. There are companies who collected data on hundreds and hundreds of thousands of cocoa farms. I've recently seen some results of a data collection of 200,000 farmers, more than 200,000, and I'm not even allowed to mention which company it was who collected it. So why are we not exchanging this data to find out really what's the farm size, what's the workload on the farm, and how much money do you need to cover costs, and how much money do you need to cover a decent living? And then we have to readjust prices. And there I'm quite optimistic for a longer future. If you would have told somebody 100 years ago that labor is not a commodity, nobody would have believed you. Laborers founded unions, we have minimum wages, we have tariff systems. And a few years ago, when the crisis came, the cocoa price went down by 36%, but not the wages in Côte d'Ivoire, but not the wages of the workers in the chocolate factories in Germany. They are protected. 100 years ago, none of them was protected. The minimum wage in Germany, we have only since 15 years or something, because people told us the moment we introduce it, the German industry will be in ruins, and somehow we are still prospering. And we need the same approach for agricultural products. It's a human rights issue and not a price issue.
Yeah, thanks. Jan, you get the last word.
Yeah, I mean, I like the optimistic perspective of Friedel, so I completely agree. And also what Michael said, of course, there are political challenges related to introducing minimum prices or de-link the price from the future market. And in the end, also what Michael said, it comes down to cooperation between the countries. And I think we have seen an increasing cooperation between key producer countries. And the more cooperate, the more they can increase their power. So I think I'm a little bit more optimistic with regard to changes in price setting regulations than Michael. So yeah, let's see about the future.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very interesting contributions. I think actually what you said, Friedel, at the end, that also, I mean, also 100 years ago in Europe, it wouldn't have been possible to have like minimum salaries and a decent living. And now it is possible. It sees that, first of all, discussion is important and ideas are important, organizing is important, cooperation is important, and also research on this is important. So I think there's, as you also said, there's a lot more research and data needed in order to make substantial proposals and to make proposals that are convincing enough for the public and for the industries and for also regulators. So thanks for your interesting contribution. Thanks for your important work on all those different levels. And yeah, we'll look at the ÖFSE website for presentations, and also ICI has published a lot of interesting presentations, Michael and Friedel with the Cocoa Barometer, and also Michael with the audio publications. I don't know, maybe we could, in the documentation of the, we'll make a documentation of the conference, and we could link to your websites and to your publications so that the audience and people who will read the documentation can also have some further reading and information. Thanks a lot for participating. Thanks a lot to the audience for your questions, and happy Easter with a lot of fair traded chocolate, hopefully.